a thumbs up. Okay, I think we'll get started. Okay, we're going to get started. I know this is going to be a fascinating talk, and I want to make sure we have enough time for your questions and discussion. So let me introduce myself. I'm Joanna Cohn. I'm the director of the Institute for Global Tobacco Control, and I'm really pleased to have Dr. Linnea Laestadius here to talk about e-cigarettes and Instagram. But let me just tell you a little bit about her background. Linnea has a PhD from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health in the Department of Health Policy and Management. And while she was here, she was a Lerner Fellow at the Center for a Livable Future. And she also has a Master's of Public Policy degree from George Washington University. Currently, she's at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee as an assistant professor in the Joseph J. Silber School of Public Health. So her interest in general is in public policy making and implementation, including issues around public health advocacy and communication. And she has been looking at corporate, institutional, and personal behaviors and how they intersect with public health and technology. And then more specifically, she's been interested in the ways that user-generated content on social media can both document and shape public health behaviors. So I think with that, I'll hand it over, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Anna. Can you guys hear me okay with the microphone? Okay, I'll take that as a yes. So again, thank you so much for having me today. My name is Linnea Laestadius, and as mentioned, I'm faculty at UWM. And I'm here today to speak about my work on the intersection of e-cigarettes and social media, or Instagram in particular. So before I start, I like to get a sense of the room. So raise your hand if you've ever been in a vape shop. Okay, so a good number of you. Raise your hand if you've ever used Instagram. So a fair mix of yeses and nos. So I'm going to provide some context for those of you who haven't so much familiarized yourself with the vaping culture and those of you who don't use Instagram. But for those of you who do understand, you'll be in a good position to understand some of the context around all of this. So as mentioned, I'm going to start a little bit with some background around e-cigarettes. And I'm referring to them as e-cigarettes and vaping devices rather than ends, simply because users continue to think of them as on this spectrum rather than using the ends language. And then from there, I'm going to be getting into my work on Instagram and e-cigarettes. So as I'm sure that all of you know, e-cigarettes are battery-powered devices that use an atomizer or a heating coil to heat up a liquid to the point of being able to vaporize it, to inhale it. And what's most frequently vaporized is something called e-liquid, colloquially. And this e-liquid is generally made of propylene glycol or vegetable glycerin, flavoring a whole host of flavors, and most often nicotine, ranging from 0 milligram per milliliter up to 24 or higher, potentially. And then there are obviously multiple types of these devices. So you have your cigalikes, your vape pens, your egos, again, vape pens, and you also have your mods, or advanced personal vaporizers. And we'll be speaking a lot about these today because that's what primarily we're finding on Instagram, is these more advanced devices. So I'll be returning to this. And I also just want to note that this is a rapidly growing field, both in terms of research and in terms of the market. So as of 2014, there were almost 500 different brands of e-cigarettes online and over 7,000 flavors. And as you can imagine, this has continued to grow since then. So I suspect that even if you just had a large enough sample of Instagram posts, you would find more than 7,000 flavors on Instagram alone. So there's a tremendous amount of variability out there. So to elaborate a little bit more on these e-cigarette types, so you have your cigalikes that very much resemble cigarettes in visual form and how you kind of use the device. You have your vape pens, and then you have your mods. And so sometimes these are conceptualized as different generations of e-cigarettes, which is a language I don't personally favor because it gives you the impression that the previous generations aren't available anymore, when in fact all of these exist in the marketplace at the same time, and people continue to use all different types of them. And so with regard to the mods, these are distinct from the other devices in that they have a much stronger battery. So you can get much more of a vapor cloud from each use. And you can also then refill these, as with the vape pens, with the e-juice. So you can use whatever flavor that you want. The mods come in a number of different types also, but I think the most helpful way to think about them is regulated and unregulated. And this is not in the policy context, but rather in the terms of electronics. So the unregulated devices, so this, for example, is a mechanical mod, which is unregulated. They generally lack circuitry. They don't have a circuit board, so there's nothing controlling these devices. You create the circuit when you press the button. which many people who are hobbyists favor because you can then amend the device in many different ways. You can build them to your satisfaction. They also lack any type of safety protocols. There's nothing there to protect you from the battery overheating and exploding in the way that you would get in a regulated device. So the regulated devices have generally circuitry and kind of they let you control the battery life and the flow of vapor in a much more even and consistent way. And many also have variable voltage and wattage. So you can heat up the e-liquid to different temperatures depending on your preference. And these are generally the box mod type versus the mechanical mod. So to speak briefly about e-cigarette use, as you can imagine, usage has gone up since the variety has increased. So as of 2014, and these are the most recent government statistics on this, 12.6% of adults had ever tried an e-cigarette, and as you might anticipate, it's a higher percentage for younger adults. In terms of actual usage, we're about 4%. And again, this breaks down by demographics quite distinctly. So you can see that men use more than women. Younger adults use more than older adults, quite notably so. And then white non-Hispanics and potentially non-Hispanic American Indians, Alaskan Natives, although that number is always a little bit difficult to assess. If we then consider youth, again, as one might predict, usage here is even higher. So usage has tripled among high school, middle school students in just a 1-year period, which is clearly something notable is happening here. In high school usage, usage in the past 30 days is up to 13.4%, which is now higher than cigarettes or hookah use. And there's something going on here with regard to e-cigarettes and conventional tobacco. There's some relationship here that we're trying to disentangle, and that there is some evidence that if you smoke e-cigs, you are more likely to start smoking conventional tobacco products. That said, I think it's important to not just think of these as a gateway to conventional smoking, but as a potential risk factor for disease in of themselves. The other thing that's noteworthy is that if you look at kind of the aggregate time trends of this is high school usage 2011 to 2014, you can see that e-cigarette use has increased dramatically while conventional cigarette use has declined. So there does appear to be an inverse relationship here where people are vaping instead of smoking. So there's definitely something happening here. But I think the clearest takeaway is that young adults and adolescents are at highest risk from these devices. So to return now to the mod devices, many people begin, especially smokers, they begin with the cig-alikes because they most closely resemble what they're used to. And then they transition over time to the more advanced mod devices. And this is for 2 key reasons. The first is the variety of flavor choices from the e-juices. And the second is that they give a more satisfying hit, again, because of the stronger battery. And so while the literature is really still out on these devices as a tool for cessation, there is at least a couple studies suggesting that daily users of mods and vape pens are more likely than cig-alike users to engage in smoking cessation. And so this may be because, again, the more satisfying hit, it's a better mechanism for delivering nicotine, and this may actually change as the cig-alikes get better. But I suspect there's also some social component to this, which will become more apparent as my research presentation continues. Another thing that's important to note as an aside was that this study found that fruit, candy, and bakery flavors were more associated with cessation, which obviously raises a whole host of questions in terms of how we should be regulating these. And this is just neither here nor there, but I thought it was worth mentioning in terms of the mod devices. Critically, though, users of these devices show greater dependency on e-cigarettes. So essentially, you're no longer addicted to smoking, but you're now addicted to vaping instead, which is clearly not an ideal scenario from a public health perspective, and I think raises some really important questions about what we mean when we say cessation in a world that has both conventional tobacco and e-cigarettes. And are we satisfied with calling it cessation when someone continues to vape for the rest of their life using nicotine e-liquid? So I think this is a discussion that needs to be had in terms of how we contextualize this in this new and exciting world of vape pens. So obviously then there are a number of health concerns associated with these directly. So they're not just a gateway concern. So the long-term effects remain unknown. We know more about the short-term effects, so we know they lead to respiratory function impairment. There's a recent study about diacetyl or diacetyl flavoring and bronchiolitis obliterans, which is also known as popcorn lung, the same thing people who are working in the popcorn factories were getting. And then obviously nicotine itself is addictive and causes a number of problems for fetal development in particular. In addition to all of these concerns, we have a whole host of other concerns. For example, that these will renormalize smoking, especially through the cig-alikes, dual use of e-cigarettes and conventional tobacco together, undermining cessation, as I mentioned, appeals to non-smokers in ways that would never happen with conventional tobacco products. So I think a key concern here is appeal to youth who would never have otherwise smoked. And then finally, there are no production standards, either for the e-juice or for the mechanisms themselves. So I don't know how many of you saw the video of the e-cigarette battery exploding in someone's pocket at the gas station. If you haven't seen it, I would encourage you all to look it up. It's a really interesting video. But it speaks to this complete lack of reduction standards, and that these are posing a number of risks to users. We also know a fair amount about promotion. So as I think all of you know, the FDA proposed rule is still under review. And so while you can't make clearly fraudulent claims about cessation, it's essentially the Wild West in terms of marketing still. So not unexpectedly, spending has increased dramatically just over the past couple of years. And we also know that younger adults are learning about e-cigarettes online and from other people. And more than 6 million high school students saw e-cigarette ads online in 2014. So the internet is clearly some type of locus for learning about e-cigarettes for youth, which makes a lot of sense when you think about youth being online more frequently than older adults. In terms of the actual messages in this promotion, traditionally they were advertised as smoking cessation devices, despite the fact that this was not an approved claim for obvious reasons, and then as healthier, more environmentally friendly, and cheaper than conventional cigarettes. So again, not in any way approved messaging, but this is what people were seeing on their websites. The newer brands, the newer devices, the mods, the messaging has changed. So the messaging is now less anchored in conventional cigarettes with fewer comparative claims, and more of a focus on the unique benefits of these devices. And so Zhu et al. Characterized this as new nicotine delivery systems, which isn't the language that they use in their marketing, obviously, but we can think about this in a new way. It's not just an e-cigarette, it's a new device, a vaping device of some type. So to switch gears a little bit now, to think about social media, there's really 3 types of content that you see on social media. The first is paid advertising, which I think we're all familiar with in some capacity. So you pay to put an ad to expose some target population. That's a separate thing. Then we have user-generated content. So if you or I were to create an Instagram account and post a picture on it, that would be true user-generated content, stuff that we had made on a free account. No one had told us to do it, we created this. Unfortunately, you also have corporate user-generated content. So brands like you or I can make a free account on Instagram and post whatever they want on it. So then you have corporate UGC, which is distinct from paid advertising, because again, it was free to create, but also the spread of these messages is quite different from the paid advertising. So you can't target a specific population with this. They have a regular account, just like you or I would. So they can only expose to people who intentionally seek out that account and follow it, or they can try to compel other users to share their messaging for them through electronic word of mouth. So when we talk about Instagram, we're really focused on these 2 categories. So paid advertising on Instagram is fairly recent. It's only recently been rolling out. And during our study period, there was actually no paid advertising, or very few people were seeing it. It was kind of a test market at that point. So this is what we were looking at in our study. So with regard to the true UGC, we know from prior literature that people do talk about their vaping online, on social media. They also look for content on social media about vaping. So we know it's out there in general terms. We also know this content really matters. So there's very little research on this, but at least one study has shown that social media depictions of tobacco use predict future smoking better than TV or movie exposures. And this isn't hugely surprising given what we know about the importance of peer networks and social norms. But this is clearly an area where more research needs to be happening. In terms of the corporate content, we know, and we can go online to the Blue e-cigs account right now if we wanted to, that these companies are creating these accounts, just like you or I, where they post content free of charge. And one recent study found that 70% of online e-cig vendors had links to social media on their pages. So they maintained an official website presence, as well as a more unofficial social media presence, where they were posting content on a more regular basis. So, Instagram. So Instagram is designed for mobile use. And in this sense, it's more like Twitter than Facebook. So you can't actually post to Instagram from a computer unless you download a third-party app. It is designed for posting from your iPhone or Android phone. And so if you've never seen Instagram before, this is what the iPhone layout looks like, and you have the Blue e-cigs account here. So every post has to have an image or short video. That is a requirement of the post. And you can certainly post a text capture instead if you didn't want to post a picture, but there is some visual aesthetic component to this. Then you have your narrative or your caption, and within this you can include hashtags. And raise your hand if you don't know what a hashtag is. Okay, good. So just briefly, they're a way of categorizing information, so it makes it searchable. And these generally they're derived through folksonomy, so a taxonomy created by people. So when people apply a hashtag, it's something that they choose. There's not like a predefined list of these. You start typing and that's the hashtag that you put in. And then you can also comment on a post and then like a post. And so Instagram traditionally has followed a chronological stream. So unlike Facebook, it's very clean. Everything is in the same stream that you follow, and your account is either fully public or fully private. You can't adjust this by individual post. So if you're doing research, it's a very easy way to get at literally what's being posted in chronological order. Unfortunately, Instagram is now debating switching to an algorithm format for their stream, which will cause a number of problems for all kinds of research projects, as well as for users who just don't like this idea. But I just wanted to mention that as well. So Instagram is used by a large number of teenagers and young adults, so almost more than one in every two. So it's clearly one of the places to go if you're interested in these populations. And it has a number of users, 400 million users, and 80 million posts are shared every day. So there's a tremendous volume that happens at any given point. And again, it's this mix of corporate and user-generated content. So in terms of past research on social media, mobile social media and e-cigs, it's really been focused on Twitter so far. There's obviously a lot of YouTube research, but I don't consider YouTube the same kind of platform as Twitter or Instagram, in that it's primarily designed for sharing video rather than making connections. And so in terms of the Twitter research, prior studies have found that the vast majority of tweets are commercial in nature. So a large focus on this corporate user-generated content versus what I consider to be kind of true user-generated content. And so focus on price promotions and very little discussion about health or cessation. Additionally, prior work has not really considered hashtag vape. We have a couple of things coming out now, but the focus has primarily been on hashtag e-cig, which is an important thing to note given that these are being marketed less as equivalents to cigarettes and more as these kind of new devices. And then finally, there was no peer-reviewed work on e-cigarettes and Instagram content, I think still right now. And just overall, there are very few studies on visual social media platforms and tobacco products of any kind. I just wanted to highlight some of these. So Szybka et al. I don't know if they published it yet, but at APHA last year was a large presentation on Instagram and smoking. And then Primark just came out with a study on hookah on Tumblr. And then there's also a very brief piece in Tobacco Control from a few years ago about Snoop Dogg and small cigars on Instagram. And that's essentially the entire universe, from my knowledge, of studies of this type. So why Instagram then? Why is Instagram such an important site for this? So first of all, the users matter. So again, it's the second most popular platform after Facebook among teens. So teens are gradually leaving Facebook as more older people join Facebook, which is understandable. And many of them are moving to Instagram. It's also a site of regular and repeated exposure. So 59% of users use it daily, and 35% visit several times a day. So it's constantly in your pocket, and you're kind of scrolling through. So if you're following an account that posts about this, you may have multiple exposures per day. And you're not kind of stopping and critically reflecting on these. You're seeing it, and then you keep scrolling, which in my understanding is exactly when advertising works best. So from this perspective, it matters. Second, visuals matter. So visual depictions of vaping increase daily smokers' urge to smoke. They also increase smokers' urge to use e-cigarettes. Right, so there's something about the visual nature of this that's very appealing. So if we then have a platform where literally every post has to have a visual component, and it also has a lot of teenagers on it, this is an extremely relevant site for understanding how this messaging might be transmitted in a very persuasive way to young adults and teenagers. So what we set out to do, and that's myself, Megan Wall, and Young Cho, all at UWM, was to determine trends and prominent e-cigarette hashtags on Instagram, and then to assess the types of e-cigarette content posted. So specifically, to learn more about e-cigarette use and promotion, so to consider how can we use Instagram as a site of learning about this, but then also what are the public health challenges posed by this content, and should we in fact be concerned about what's happening here? So as a first step, so I should say that we took a sort of qualitative exploratory approach with a slight mixed methods angle. So first we wanted to identify the hashtags that were kind of used in association with e-cigs. So we took a very holistic exploratory approach to this. We kind of dove into the data on Instagram and kind of just assessed what appears to be co-occurring and which of these are more popular. So these aren't the most popular hashtags of all. These are the ones that we felt were most relevant and important together with e-cig. And so again, you can apply there's a certain cap, but it's a very large number of hashtags that you can apply together. So we ended up with e-cigarette, vape, vaping, Vapelife with a Y, vape porn, similar to food porn, and then e-juice. And so then we tracked these on Instagram biannually, so twice a year, from March 2014 through October 2015. And we didn't collect this data this entire time, which would have been a very data-intensive endeavor. We used the Instagram app to simply record the number of posts at each time. So we used the technology with us instead of sort of against us. And then we selected hashtag eSig and hashtag vape for in-depth qualitative content analysis. And so we used Iconosquare for this. How many of you are familiar with Iconosquare? So Iconosquare is an official authorized third-party website that lets you tap into the API directly onto your computer. So the benefit of this is twofold. First of all, you don't have to log in, which eliminates any concerns about accidentally using your personal account and getting posts that are private that you shouldn't have been getting. And second, it's much easier to screen cap things on your computer than on your iPhone, because the screen cap earlier was actually 2 pictures overlaid on each other because the interface is too long to capture everything at one time. So this just facilitated this a little bit. So in terms of then the more in-depth sample, we collected 60 consecutive posts from each hashtag in October 2014. So again, this is a chronological stream, so it's kind of a snapshot moment of time sample. And we collected 30 additional for codebook development. Then we eliminated duplicate posts, posts only about marijuana and not marijuana and vaping. And then we revisited these posts in January 2015, and we took out all the posts that were deleted or made private. This is something that I argue should be a best practice when doing this type of work because it's such a gray area ethically. So my IRB at UWM said, this is not human subject research, knock yourself out. But we know that social media users have expectations of privacy, even if their accounts are public. Because if you post something, you don't expect a researcher to come along and take your picture and study it or to print it in a presentation or whatever. So at a minimum, I think we need to give people the opportunity to withdraw from research implicitly. And one way to do this is to create some type of window of time in which if people delete their post because they regret it or they make their whole account private, so we respect that by taking that data out of our pool. So that's what we did. And in retrospect, we should have gone for a larger sample size in light of this, but this is something that I've taken as a lesson learned going forward. And then we double coded the remaining 85 posts. And so we developed an inductive-deductive codebook that we applied holistically to the image, text, and hashtags together. And this is kind of best practice in the field because it's very hard to understand what's happening in a post without considering all of these together. And I should add that emoji were also considered in this coding, which led to a number of interesting discussions about how we understand an emoji in the context of some specific hashtag. And we also looked for some specific known elements from e-cigarette advertising. And then we also coded for metadata, so just recorded that, and user type. So we wanted to understand if they were an individual user or a commercial user of some type. So to do this, we went back to their account profile page. So we looked at their username, anything in their profile description, any links or phone numbers. And then we looked at the overall posts in their account. So if everything was a promotion and they appeared to be a brand, we coded them as a brand. If they had a personal username and no link to anywhere, but still had primarily promotions, we coded them as a representative of a brand, but not working directly for a brand. So there's a lot of nuances in kind of this, but it was also time consuming to kind of go back and do all of this. And finally, we ended up with 19 codes, and most of these had subcodes, and these weren't mutually exclusive. So this was a fairly labor-intensive process to code all of these. So starting with the trends over time in these hashtags, this is 2014, 2015. These 8 hashtags. So vape in purple is the one on top here. You can see it's been increasing almost exponentially. E-cigarettes are on the bottom, and e-cig is the blue one here that's about to be taken over by e-juice. So you can see that in terms of how people are talking about this, not much is happening in terms of e-cig. Much more is happening in terms of vape, which is why if you're doing social media work, you really need to be thinking about vape and not just e-cig. It also speaks to this idea from work on the marketing messages that these aren't contextualized as e-cigarettes anymore so much as new devices for vaping. So every time I give this presentation, I update the count for vape posts. So in December of last year, it was 6 million vape posts. By February, there were 7 million vape posts. And last night, we were up to almost 8 million vape posts. So this continues to grow rapidly. So there's a lot to unpack here. So who's posting in our smaller sample? So it was about 41% personal users, about 60% corporate users. So a number of corporate users, but still significantly less than the Twitter samples from previous work. And vendors were the largest single user type. And these were all very small vendors, so like small kind of mom and pop online stores. Most of them were located in the US, and we figured this out based on location data officially reported on the post, if they turn that on, profile info, and hashtags used that were geographically specific. We also found some posts from Indonesia and Canada, but there were also a number that we could not figure out where the post was being made from. About 20% depicted men, about 5% depicted women, but actually more posts just pictured e-cigarettes and e-juice than people. So there was a real focus on the devices and the e-juice rather than people using the devices. And then I should also note that Instagram doesn't provide demographic information on users. So when you sign up, they want to know if you're over 13, but that's it. That's not to say that they can't infer pretty much anything about you from your usage, but that's not data that they officially collect or that they share with anyone at this point. So while Facebook, if you have kind of a campaign, they'll give you all this demographic data, you don't get that on Instagram. So you're kind of on your own. So just to give you some examples here you have your typical personal versus typical corporate posts. And these are all screen captured on my Iconosquare, which is why we have this black background. So you can kind of see here that there's certainly a way to depict these, right? It's a kind of a shared angle. So here we have a promotion. If you can't see the hashtags here, it's vape, Gucci, vapor, sig, ballin, boss, beast, mod, etc. So clearly kind of displaying this as a status symbol. But look at this vape device I have, look how cool I am. So these were kind of the conventional things that we were seeing in each category. So we have found 4 key findings in our sample. E-cigarette promotions were common. They're portrayed as distinct from smoking. There's quite a bit of fetishization of these devices, and also the formation of an online community vaping identity. So I'll cover each of these briefly. So e-cig promotions, a large volume of this among corporate and individual posts. So 92% of corporate posts were promotional, about 50% of personal posts, which was much higher than we would have thought for personal posts. But this is because of the strong emphasis on contests, which requires you to share posts. And again, you can't retweet on Instagram. To share a post, you have to download a secondary application. So it's actually quite labor intensive to do this. So here's an example, Breast Cancer Awareness Month giveaway. I thought you guys would like that one. 500 followers, someone will receive an SS Nemesis clone, which is part of a mechanical mod, as best I can understand, a Vapelife t-shirt, and a bottle of the Leash Premium e-juice. So then to enter this, you have to repost this picture and tag people. So this has been an incredibly effective way, in our sample at least, of getting other people to carry these messages for these brands out even further into Instagram. And we actually found not a single post critical of e-cigarettes in the sample that we have. So again, it was a small sample, but it wasn't in our sample, certainly. So we also found that vaping was characterized quite distinctively from smoking, and there were very few comparisons. So we only found 23% mentioned cessation, and 16 mentioned vaping is healthier than smoking. And I should say that these are very generously coded. So if someone had, for example, a hashtag that said like smoke-free or no smoke, we interpreted that in the overall context potentially as falling under these categories. In terms of actual discussion of these, extremely minimal. So this is a generous estimate of these. And none of them mentioned affordability relative to cigarettes. Price promotions, sure, but not compared to conventional cigarettes. Actually, we found some hostility towards big tobacco. Some people were very clear that they were opposed to big tobacco, which you may kind of pause and wonder, well, we know that some of these companies are owned by big tobacco. Well, we actually didn't find a single company or e-cigarette device that was owned by big tobacco in our sample. There was no Mark 10, no Blue, no Views. They just weren't there. What we found instead was a whole lot of smaller brands like Hexohm and Kingertech. So Hexohm is these colorful ones up in the corner here from a website. So you can see that just conceptually they are not anchored at all in cig-likes anymore. They have a different form, a different color. They are going a very different place. So you can understand why these comparisons may not be happening anymore. And what we did see instead was a really big focus on mods, customized parts, and builds, as well as e-juice. And actually there was a really heavy promotion of e-juice going on. The other thing we found in terms of distinctions was novel vaping practices that you can't engage with regular cigarettes. You can only use them for mod devices. So one of these was, for example, sub-ohming, which is reducing the electrical resistance of the coils in your atomizer to create larger plumes of vapor. Unfortunately, this may also cause the battery to explode, and that's like a warning they will tell you on websites about how to do this. Another one is dripping, which is a little bit more common. So you kind of drip the juice in, and you get a better flavor potentially, else you can switch flavors more rapidly. And then finally, cloud chasing, which is essentially engaging in these types of behaviors to create the large plumes of vapor that you can. And so again, these raise biological and injury risk concerns. So this post here has both sub-ohm and dripping hashtags applied to it. And for those of you who don't have this kind of in your mind, so here we have kind of a diagram. Again, the atomizer, where the coils are, is part that heats up the e-liquid. And the atomizer, or essentially a clearomizer, is essentially a clear atomizer, has these tank and then the coil is built into it. And so while these devices are technically quite simple, the idea is very simple, they're becoming quite sophisticated in terms of the market for products and the different variations of the pieces. So we also found a number of posts talking about devices as status, and a lot of showing off of builds or new devices. So you have here part of a mechanical mod, so rocking that Kennedy with the SMPL mod. So again, they're kind of showing off that they've built this. It's a status thing to be able to build this. We also found posts depicting or mentioning mods that more commonly use the vape porn hashtag, which kind of makes sense, right? Because you're showing off this device. It's something that you're proud of. I think it's important to think about this in the context of conspicuous consumption and how much are people consuming these devices to kind of show off, and how much are they deriving actual kind of inherent value from these. Particularly in a world of visual social media, this becomes a really relevant question. And so finally, 81% of our posts had hashtags indicating community or identity. So things like vape community, vape fam, cloud chaser, vapeaholic, girls who vape, Vapelife. This was very prevalent in our sample. And so we cropped this to protect her identity here, but so you have here, for example, drip life, vape fam, vape community, vape porn, girls who vape, girls vape hard. So again, you apply these to yourself. These are a folksonomy process. You develop these, you invent these, you apply these because you feel like applying them. No one is necessarily telling you to do this. And so these appear to be forming particularly around the mods and the modding community. So this wasn't statistically significant, but these are more common on a mod than the non-mod posts. Interestingly, and I think unexpectedly for us, we found that brands and vendors were really reinforcing this using the same hashtags. So again, not statistically significant, but actually brands and vendors were slightly more likely to use these identity and community hashtags than users, which raises some really interesting questions about who's driving this and who maybe initially kind of identify these hashtags. So that's an area to unpack further. And I think it's important to ask, are these real communities? Or are they just hashtags? And there is some evidence suggesting that within hashtag networks, people interact even among non-followers. So if you post something with Vapelife and I don't follow you, I might search for Vapelife and then like and comment on your post without ever following you. So you have interaction within the kind of nodes of the hashtag network, even without following each other. So there appears to be something real there. And we also know that there is an in real life vaping community. There are vaping conventions. The question is, are these the same community? Are they different communities? Are people members of both of them? So lots to unpack here. And then finally, I just wanted to, well, not finally, almost finally, I just wanted to illustrate with a meme of how these kind of things escalate. So you begin with a simple vape pen, and the next thing you know, you have multiple mechanical mods, e-juice flavors, parts for building. So this is kind of a known phenomenon in the vaping culture, that people will escalate in their vaping identity. And so I think it's important to also note that this is not an identity that you are taking on alone, that there is a subculture here happening. And so from the marketing literature, this idea of subcultures of consumption, which I think is really relevant, and this idea that people will self-select based on their shared commitment to a particular product class or consumption activity, in this case vaping, and form a subculture. So this turned into branded communities in the marketing literature, which I think is not as relevant, but going back to this idea of subcultures of consumption, I think there's a lot we can learn from this. And so they have these kind of identifiers of these subcultures, so unique jargon, shared symbolic expression, social structure conferred by commitment or knowledge about, for example, building a modding device. So this does appear to be present. And they also identify 3 stages of membership in these. So experimentation, identification, mastery, and internalization. And from the tobacco literature, we know that if people are reaching a stage of internalization, we're in big trouble when it comes to getting people to stop using these devices. So this certainly signals that something's happening that we maybe need to unpack a little bit further. So to begin to wrap up, brands and vendors are existing in the same space, just interchangeably online. And so you have then implicit and explicit promotion of e-cigarettes. It's a very positive environment for e-cigarettes online right now. We also know that people find it worthwhile to share e-cigarette content. For whatever reason, they're deriving some type of pleasure from doing this, where they will, unsolicited or through context injuries, feel prompted to share this content. And so it's a potential source of exposure that can't be regulated. The individual content is protected speech. It is not commercial speech if you say, oh, I love my mods so much. It might be if you share a formal contest entry. I don't think that's clear. But for the most part, we can't get at UGC through policy directly. We could potentially pressure Instagram on this point, but other than that, not much we can do from policy sides. And the brands and vendors are all very small in our sample. People would definitely fly under the radar in the absence of a very rigorous enforcement scheme or getting Instagram on board in terms of getting these people off from posting. So something to be aware of. We also know from prior literature that overestimating pure smoking rates is really an unfortunate thing. So if you were to search for vape and see 7 million posts, you would get the impression that everyone's vaping, which we know is definitely not the case. So in terms of campaigns, one strategy might be to just tell people that not everyone is in fact doing this, as with conventional cigarettes. We also see these identities and communities forming. Again, problematic. Self-identifying as a smoker escalates smoking. Also makes it less likely that you will quit smoking. So we know from tobacco literature this is not a good thing. Do we know if it will translate perfectly to vaping? No. So this is an area for more research. And then finally, there's a clear focus on mods and their unique features, and that these are definitely coming across as status symbols, at least in whatever subculture exists around this on Instagram. And while these devices may support cessation, which I think is particularly understandable if there is kind of a built-in social support network around this, that if you are a member and see yourself as a vapor, that may help cessation. But it may also lead to addiction to vaping, which again is not necessarily a desirable long-term outcome either. And then finally, I just want to note that I think it's clear that Instagram does provide a window into subcultures that we might not otherwise have. So it lets us see things through the eyes of people and their lived experiences that we may not get through interviews, for example. So a couple limitations to note. Again, we took an in-depth analysis with a small sample, so it's not generalizable to all of Instagram by any means. We excluded all the private posts. And then the deleted posts may have been distinct in some way, which is something that we can definitely go back and look at if we have time and resources. So to identify a couple future research needs that we found were important. So first of all, how do the effects of peer exposures compare to corporate exposure on social media? Is it more detrimental to see your friend post this than a company? And if so, how do we get at that? Second of all, what are the norms and expectations within these hashtag-based communities? So some type of ethnography or netnography work would be really interesting here. Third, what are the effects of internalizing vaping identity? Does it follow with smoking identity? And further, does applying a hashtag actually result in this? So I think this is a particularly interesting question. And then finally, why are people creating this content? And since we can't actually regulate this traditionally, could we intervene through behavioral interventions to get at some of the motivations for posting about this? And so these are where we're going with this sort of big picture future. And with that, I will wrap up and take any questions from the audience. Yeah.
What do you think public health roles should be in terms of actively engaging in Instagram? Because obviously we could use the same hashtags and infiltrate subcultures with our own agenda. Do you think that's appropriate, or is it irresponsible?
I don't think it's inappropriate, because people hijack hashtags all the time. So I mean, we had a lot of relevant posts in our sample, but for any research you do on this, you search a hashtag, at least like 10% of your posts will be totally irrelevant. People are just applying the hashtag to whatever it is you're pushing. So I see no reason why you couldn't have a public health account with some type of messaging about vaping with the hashtag Vapelife on it. It is relevant to the Vapelife in some tangential way. I think the harder thing in the face of not doing that is that no one wants to follow public health accounts. Like, you don't want someone in your pocket telling you what to do and like that what you're doing is bad. So I think the best strategy might actually be to use the hashtags. Yeah.
And did you find any examples of that?
Of public health messaging?
Yeah, from whomever.
Not in our sample. In our broader kind of exploration of this, we found a lot of posts that were hijacking public health messaging, like using conventional anti-tobacco messaging and being like, hey, vaping is so good. Look, we don't do all these things that conventional tobacco does. Actually, there's a paper out on that now. It just came out a couple weeks ago. But yeah, not in our sample, no, in the opposite. Yeah?
I was wondering if you saw, I don't know, any, I guess, like users hijacking the Vapelife hashtags to kind of mock the subculture. I feel like I've seen sort of an undercurrent of people saying, oh, it's just like these fedora-wearing nerds who...
Yeah. Again, our sample was pretty small, and we didn't get any of that. I suspect that it's, I mean, I know I'm familiar, like there's the meme of the train, and it says, I get it, you vape, and there's like a huge cloud of vapor coming out of the train, right? So it's definitely out there, but I think it's more of a friendly jibing versus like a kind of defamation or stigmatization of the culture. Yeah. Yeah.
Did you find any ways to like get to the sources of these hashtags? Because I don't know if Instagram shows you like the first use of hashtags, so you can find if it's older generated or user generated.
With 7 million posts, like you would have to download all of them. And I think with the API, you can only move forwards, not backwards. You can certainly scroll through as far as you can get down, but I don't know if you would feasibly get through 7 million of them. But it's a really important question. That I think maybe if you can speak to people more qualitatively who have been in the scene for a very long time, they might have some recollection of how these hashtags emerge. So that's a really interesting question. Yeah?
I think building on that too, I think vape is the term that the industry uses, and a lot of us in public health are not entirely comfortable with the term, because it's not really vape, it's an aerosol, right?
Yeah.
And so you sort of started with, you know, you're going to use these terms because they're the ones that are commonly generated by the user.
Yeah.
How do you reconcile some of that?
So I think from my perspective, I mean, I'm not necessarily trying to educate anyone about what vaping really is. I'm more trying to understand where they're coming from and contextualize that so we can inform interventions. I don't necessarily think that those campaigns are very effective because I think vape is so ingrained in the culture at this point. We all call them vape shops. Even public health people don't call them aerosol shops. So, yeah, Lisa.
I wonder with the big tobacco kind of backlash is something that's pretty interesting to me, and I wonder if you had a chance to look at the brands and vendors, if they're using that as sort of a way to distinguish themselves in sort of this identity.
That's a good question. We can definitely go back and look at that. We didn't code for that specifically, but we have that data. Off the top of my head, I do think that a number of the brands were using the kind of big tobacco hashtags and stuff like this. Yeah. Yeah, Kate.
So, Linnea, you and I have talked in the past about about the challenges of doing in-depth analysis and this sort of really contextualized deep dive
Yeah.
when you have this just astronomically large data set. And I know that you've been pretty critical, and I think I agree with the automated coding of this.
Right.
Have you come up with any sort of alternatives of what might be the right way to do, I think, put people's eyes on a larger number of these posts?
Well, aside from just hiring a bunch of RAs and like paying like a dozen people to do this, it's difficult. I mean, you can probably make an algorithm that will make sense of the image content and the text together. I think where things get tricky is the hashtags and the emojis, and also considering everything contextually together. There's some digital humanities approaches that kind of let you put in a whole bunch of pictures to find kind of the trends in them all together and like zoom in on different things. And that might be one avenue to like narrow in on a smaller sample, at least within a larger body of pictures. But I mean, I'm a qualitative researcher, so I'm like incredibly biased in favor of doing stuff by hand, but I haven't figured out a better way to consistently make sense of these aside from just looking at each one of these. Yeah. Oh, sorry, Kate, did you want to follow?
Just a quick follow-up question. What was the rationale for picking a
Yeah, so I think from my perspective, so I was thinking, I think, about how I use Instagram. When I'm curious about a hashtag, I'll search it and then kind of scroll through consecutively. I mean, probably 50 posts or so. Because if you have it on the smaller picture, they go pretty quickly. And I think I wanted to kind of replicate that in the design for what you would find if someone actually searched for this, given this idea that people will search and get the sense that everyone's posting about this. So that was my strategy. Yeah.
So I was just wondering if based on like the images that you saw of like the user-generated images, if you had any ideas about how to regulate the product itself. So it seemed like a lot of images had like the big like smoke cloud or the mods. So is there any like potential to try to regulate the aerosol generated, or make it like clear? I don't know chemistry very well, but like make it clear or regulate some of these mod sort of products.
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, some type of manufacturing standard might help at least the newer users, because right now, like, there's nothing. You might go buy mechanical mod and try to like do all this stuff yourself, like as a complete beginner, which will not end well for you, is my understanding. But if there was some type of like official, like this device has been approved, you may have newer users drawn towards the approved devices versus kind of diving into the deep end of these modifications. Certainly, I think if you could make the vapor clear, I was reading something that said that one of the ingredients added actually do give it its kind of color, so you might be able to do it without that. It would certainly eliminate this idea of the contests, like the plume blowing contests. And I think part of the competitive element there would be eliminated. That said, people will blend their own e-juice. Like people will buy a giant vat of nicotine and just mix it all together themselves. So if you took it off the market, you'd probably see more people blending their own. Yeah.
One of the things that's super interesting about this vaping community that you found, I think, is the potential to kind of like mobilize political action.
Yes.
Did you find anything there where people were sort of advocating?
Yeah, so we did code for policy relevant messages, and we didn't see anyone or explicitly talk about this, but we did see the hashtag I'm proof a lot of time. And so we looked up this hashtag. We spent a lot of time looking up hashtags, for the record. And I'm proof took us to a website for the I'm proof movement, which may be defunct in terms of the website had been updated for like a year. But it was people who indicated they were proof that vaping works as a cessation device, that had improved their lives immeasurably, and so they were opposed to any policy efforts. And so these we coded as having a policy message, but that was the extent of it. I think in a larger sample, though, you would get a small number of policy-oriented posts. Yeah. For one or two more questions. Yeah.
So you talked about this as sort of a jumping off point for a program of future research, and you also mentioned at the beginning that the FDA has not come out with their rule yet. Do you see any immediate implications of the work that you presented for the FDA in thinking about how to deal with e-cigarettes? I think you mentioned a couple already.
Yeah, well, I think there's such a focus on paid advertising for obvious reasons. But when we're talking about social media, the corporate user-generated content is probably a greater concern than the advertising. And that might be something that could be addressed through regulatory mechanisms. So if anything, I would want to put that on the FDA's radar. And especially going after these smaller companies that would otherwise just kind of you wouldn't know about them. You wouldn't think to search for them. And unless you're searching by hashtag, that's really the only way you're going to find them. So.
Great. Well, thanks for your questions, and thanks for
Great. Thank you so much.
presentation.